Lecture 22, Mythic Heroes, Gilgamesh.
In our last lecture, we defined hero and heroic myth, and we introduced the idea of the monomyth, that is, a hypothetical mythic narrative which is universal, which can transcend the cultural and temporal boundaries to make something like the story of the human hero. We also talked about some of the psychological foundations of the idea of the monomyth, stemming from the theories of Freud and Otto Rank and Carl Jung. And we also mentioned that the psychological became perhaps the favorite way of reading myths in the last century. And then we ended last time with a schematic, simplified, composite model for the monomyth to be used as an analytic tool in this and the next lectures. This time, we want to deal with a Mesopotamian poem of Gilgamesh and then put it up against the template to see how well it fits. And we'll end by looking closely at one episode, the attempted seduction of Gilgamesh by the goddess Ishtar, which will take us back to some of the things we learned about the eclipse of the goddess back in Lecture 16. The most complete version of the poem that we're looking at today comes from the 7th century BCE from the library of the Assyrian king Assurbanipal, but the poem has to be much older than that. Gilgamesh seems to have been the king of Uruk, which was one of the Sumerian cities around the Arabian Gulf, somewhere around 2700 BCE. He was a successful king, especially known for his ambitious building program, and shortly after his death, heroic poems began to be written about him. By now, something like half a dozen have been recovered, all of them in fragmentary states, but all clearly songs praising Gilgamesh. As we've already seen in earlier lectures, the Sumerians themselves were overrun by Semitic invaders who were far less civilized than the Sumerians were. So they conquered the Sumerians, but they absorbed much of their learning, their arts, their crafts, their religion, their mythology, and as we've pointed out, there was a succession of empires that dominated the Middle East over the next 2 millennia. In one of them, the Babylonian, a Babylonian scribe somewhere between about 2000 and 1800 BCE, his name has come down to us as Sin-Leqi-Unini, either took all of the available Gilgamesh materials and wove them into one big story, or he copied someone else who had already done that. His name is the one that's inscribed on the tablets, clay tablets from Babylon, and it's the only name that we have attached to this poem. So we don't know for sure whether he was the Babylonian Homer who actually did the weaving or whether he was a mere copyist, but he's the one who gets credit for this poem anyway. Whoever did it incorporated into it a flood story that we looked at back in Lecture 9. And then from there on, the poem passed through successive empires until it arrived at the library of Assurbanipal of Assyria in the 7th century. Pieces of it have shown up in lots of other cultures in the area. The Hittites have one, the Hurrians have one, various people of Canaan. It had a widespread distribution. This would have to have been considered a bestseller in its day. Modern editions are based on the Assyrian one, but they usually are emended with other copies from other places, since the clay tablets have deteriorated in some places, even in the best versions we have. It's the oldest piece of literature we have in the world, especially if the oldest parts date back to somewhere shortly after 2700 BCE. The poem itself is divided up into 2 unequal parts. The first 2/3 of it is pretty much a straightforward heroic story about larger-than-life characters who perform a series of great deeds. Like a lot of other early heroes, Gilgamesh is partly divine. His mother is a goddess, his father is a mortal. We're told in the poem that he's 2/3 of a god and 1/3 human, and while that's difficult to work out genetically, it probably means that he's more divine than human, which accounts for his extraordinary energies and abilities. He's already the king of Uruk when the poem opens. And while people are pleased to have such a vigorous and strong and powerful and ambitious king, he is nevertheless wearing them out, particularly with his exploits in sex and building. The people pray to the gods for relief, say, we're just ordinary people. We can't deal with a king like this. And so they pray to the gods for relief, saying, you've got to ease our burden in some way or other from what we're doing here. And so what the gods do, the goddess Ururu, in fact, specifically creates a creature, another heroic creature, as a sort of match, as a sort of companion for Gilgamesh. She makes him out of clay, and then she covers his body with hair so that, in a way, he's really as much animal as he is human. And then she sets him down in the wilderness, and he grows up with animals. He makes, as we can see, a perfect complement to Gilgamesh, who's half human and half divine, whereas Enkidu, which is the name of this new character, is half human and half animal. Enkidu lives and grows up with animals, and in fact, trappers who come out to try to trap these animals keep having their traps sprung and the animals released, and one day a trapper discovers what's happening. That is, Enkidu is helping the animals escape. Having seen Enkidu, the trapper is terrified, and he asks his father, what can I do? I can't confront this character. What do I do about him? And so his father says, go back to Uruk and ask for a temple prostitute to come back with him. A temple prostitute in this case is not a simple streetwalker, but she's one of those priestesses dedicated to the service of the goddess, perhaps dedicated to Ishtar herself as the principal deity of Uruk. We talked about those temple priestesses back in Lecture 9. She does come back with the trapper, and she spends 7 days and 6 nights teaching Enkidu what is called in the poem the woman's art. After the time they've spent together, when he tries to go back to the animals, they reject him. He's no longer one of them. The priestess has changed him in some important ways. So he goes back to the Hierophant and he says, what do I do now? The animals won't have anything to do with me anymore. And she tells him that what he's lost in natural energy, he's gained in wisdom. And she promises to take him to Uruk to meet Gilgamesh. On the way there, they spend time with shepherds. They stop as a kind of transitional halfway place. They stop with shepherds, and there Enkidu is taught how to eat human food, how to wear clothes, how to drink wine, how to cut his hair, how to anoint his body and hair with oil. And the shepherds also teach him, this is a really important detail, they teach him how to hunt those same animals with which he had once lived. He does this to help the shepherds protect their flocks. Once all of that's accomplished, it's off to Uruk to meet Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh, in the meantime, has been having dreams about a companion who is going to show up and with whom he is going to spend a great deal of time. When Enkidu actually shows up in Uruk, Gilgamesh is in the middle of doing one of those things that really annoys his people. That is, he is claiming first night rights with a bride. He does this with all brides, that he gets the first night and then the groom gets every night thereafter. He never gets to this bride's house, however, because on the way he meets with Enkidu. And then the two face off like gunslingers in a Western movie. The two of them face off, they size each other up, and then they begin to wrestle. It turns out to be a really stunning wrestling match in which half the city gets destroyed and the doorposts get broken up. But eventually, after a long, hard match, Gilgamesh wins, and then when he helps Enkidu to his feet, they shake hands, they embrace, they become fast friends. Now Gilgamesh has a companion who is virtually his equal. And so now Gilgamesh begins to channel his energy in ways that are constructive and will leave his citizens unmolested. He's aware of his own mortality, at least in an abstract kind of way, and so he wants to do something so glorious that it'll be remembered forever. And now that he has a friend, he can also memorialize the friendship, since the two will do their deeds together. Despite warnings from his mother, from everyone in the city, the pair eventually goes off to the cedar forests. And after a series of really interesting adventures, they confront and kill Humbaba, the guardian of the cedar forests. And, although the text doesn't quite say this, presumably they bring back cedars with which to help build up Uruk. The pair comes back from their quest covered in glory, and there's a great parade in their honor. This is probably the Uruk equivalent of a ticker tape parade for these two heroes coming down the streets of Uruk. So far, the poem has been pretty much straightforward, heroic, and the story has followed the lines that we might expect it to. Heroes with superhuman qualities travel to strange lands, they kill monsters, and they return to the community with a boon. Here, two boons actually. They bring back their own fame, which is what they did it for, and they bring back the cedars for building up the city. This could be a heroic myth in itself. The poem could end here, and it fulfills most of the requirements of the monomyth that we looked at last time. But this isn't the end of the story. The story actually goes on from here. Ishtar is the Semitic name for Inanna, the goddess we looked at back in Lecture 14, the goddess of love and fertility and the patron deity of Uruk. And she, looking down at this ticker tape parade that they're having in Uruk, is so impressed with how beautiful Gilgamesh is, how striking he looks, what a magnificent man he is, that she offers him a chance to become her consort. He turns her down in what turn out to be somewhat insulting terms. She is insulted, and she sends down the bull of heaven to ravage the city. Gilgamesh and Enkidu gird themselves once again. They take on and fight the bull, and they wind up killing it. This time, the gods decide that the pair has gone too far, and one of them has to die. Enkidu is the one chosen as the victim. He dies, the poem tells us, from a long, wasting illness. He doesn't die quickly. It takes him a very long time to die. Gilgamesh tends his friend all of the days he's ill and then holds him in his arms as he dies. And, the poem tells us, he holds him in his arms even though after he is dead, even until the worm fastens on his body. The experience here changes Gilgamesh. Up until now, he had considered that the immortality that he and Enkidu had won in achieving names for themselves was all the immortality he needed. Now he's aware of what death really looks like, and now he becomes frightened and he decides that he needs to do something about it. If you've ever been with someone at the moment of actual death, you know what kind of experience he just went through. We all know that we're going to die. We all admit this in an abstract way, but somehow being in the physical presence of death and seeing what it does to a human being can change us forever, because it is a startling and stunning experience. And it makes the knowledge of our own mortality visceral in some kinds of way. It's in our pulses now. It's in our hearts. It's not just something we know in our head. So he sets out on a solitary journey to find Utnapishtim, who's the Noah of the Sumerian flood story, who holds, he thinks, the secret to eternal life. Gilgamesh strips himself of all of his kingly trappings. He covers himself in animal skins, and then, as a pilgrim, goes out in search of a magic remedy against death. It's a long and difficult journey. He goes to the ends of the earth. He has to go through leagues of impenetrable darkness. He has to go past the sentinels who guard the way. He has to go through the garden of the gods, where jewels instead of fruit grows on the trees. Finally, he reaches the ocean of death, across which he makes his way to the island of Utnapishtim, where he hears the flood story. We've already looked at that flood story in Lecture 9, so we don't need to go back over all of the details. For Gilgamesh, the point of Utnapishtim's story is that it was a one-time deal. It was special circumstances. Yes, I was given immortality, but it will never happen again. It cannot be repeated. There is no hope, Gilgamesh, that you could avoid death. Utnapishtim's wife says, well, you know, he's come so far. Isn't there something we can give him? And so Utnapishtim gives him access to a plant that can restore youth. It doesn't make you immortal, but it means that as long as you live, you can retain your youth. He tends the plant on the way home very carefully, taking care of it. But when he's bathing in a well one night, a snake comes up and eats it. Etiologically, this explains why the snake sheds its skin and renews its youth. But for Gilgamesh, it means that his entire quest has been a failure. He comes home wiser, but no nearer avoiding that great human catastrophe of death. That's what he set out to do, and that's what he fails to do. He brings home with him, when he comes back to Uruk, he brings home Urshanabi, the ferryman who ferried him across the ocean of death. And he shows Urshanabi the great walls that Gilgamesh has built. And then he says to Urshanabi, he says, climb up on these walls and look to see what I have achieved. And here's what he says to Urshanabi. He says, climb up onto the wall of Uruk, inspect its foundation terrace, and examine well the brickwork. See if it is not of burnt bricks. And did not the 7 wise men lay these foundations? 1/3 of the whole city, 1/3 his garden, and 1/3 is field with the precinct of the goddess Ishtar. These parts and the precinct are all Uruk. Urshanabi understands that this is Gilgamesh's claim to immortality, and then the poet ends the poem this way. This too was the work of Gilgamesh, the king who knew the countries of the world. He was wise, he saw mysteries and knew secret things. He brought us a tale of the days before the flood. He went on a long journey, was weary, worn out with labor, and returning, engraved on a stone, the whole story. Well, this turns out to be a very rich piece as literature. As a literary work, it's already been covered in 2 other teaching company courses, one my own and one it's covered by Elizabeth Vandiver in a course called The Great Authors of the Western Literary Tradition. And so you can go to either one of those courses to find a fuller explication of it as literature. But a word at least needs to be said about it as literature here. Gilgamesh's own story is a story about coming to terms with his own mortality. He begins the poem as a heroic young man who's able to do anything he wants. And like all young people, he can't imagine things ever being different than they are. He's full of energy, he's full of life, and he squanders his gifts on what his citizens see as wasteful or unnecessary projects. When Enkidu enters the picture, then Gilgamesh is provided with a focus. Now he wants to do something with a friend that the world will never forget, which at that time looks like sufficient immortality. So they go off to the cedar forest. They kill Humbaba, just what heroes are supposed to do. But the death of Enkidu again refocuses Gilgamesh's attention. Having held his dying and then his dead friend in his arms, he's aware in a visceral way of what death does to humans, and he's frightened. He says over and over again, when he's traveling on his quest for immortality, whenever someone looks at him, sees him and says, "You look so beat up, you look so tired, what are you looking for? Where are you going? What are you trying to do?" He always gives the same answer, and this is his answer. "What my brother is now, that shall I be when I am dead. Because I am afraid of death, I will go as best I can to find Utnapishtim, whom they call the Far Away, for he has entered the assembly of the gods." But he fails. He returns empty-handed, but, as the poet says at the end, having achieved wisdom. Utnapishtim tells him when he's with Utnapishtim on his island, your job is to go back to your kingdom and be a good king, since that's what you really are supposed to be doing. We think that when he returns, he will be a better king than the one who harassed his citizens, so that they had to pray to the gods for relief. Along the way to Utnapishtim's island, he stops at an inn on the ocean of death. It is kept by an innkeeper, Siduri, who is a goddess herself, and she asks him the usual question, "Where are you going? What are you looking for? Why do you look so beat up?" He gives his usual answer, and then she says to him, "You will never find that life for which you are looking. When the gods created man, they allotted to him death, but life they retained in their own keeping. As for you, Gilgamesh, fill your belly with good things. Day and night and day, dance and be merry, feast and rejoice. Let your clothes be fresh, bathe yourself in water. Cherish the little child that holds your hand, and make your wife happy in your embrace, for this too is the lot of man." At the moment, interestingly, Gilgamesh rejects that advice, since he's looking for something more than that. He's looking for immortality. Later, by the time he comes home, we think that he may find this a more plausible kind of answer. And the poem puts this advice forward as one way of thinking about what it means to be human. The poem has much more than this in it, of course, as literature. It's about the Middle Eastern understanding of human evolution. As we see, as Enkidu goes from being a wild man living with animals to a shepherd to civilized man, it's about sex as the special art of woman as a civilizing force, and that's illustrated by the Hierophant who leads Enkidu from the wilderness to pastoralism and then to the city. It's about the way also in which when we move into cities, we lose touch with our natural roots, as Enkidu does, when with the shepherds, he actually comes to kill the animals he used to live with. This is a very profound understanding, and it's one that was very important to the Sumerians. As we've mentioned earlier, they're some of the first people in the world to have lived in cities, and they began to understand what some of the implications were for living in cities. In a different story, not from this poem, but a different story, Inanna, who's the goddess of Uruk, goes to Enki, the god of wisdom, and asks for the blessings of civilization for her city. He says, well, yes, she can have the gifts of civilization for her city, but there are two conditions. The first is that you can't pick and choose. You have to take them all. And so you can't just say, I'll take 6, 7, and 8. You have to take all of them at once. And the second is that once you've taken them, you can never give them back. Once you have come to live in cities, there is no going back to nature. It cannot happen, because once those gifts are accepted, they become permanent. And so Enkidu learns this himself when he moves from the animals to the shepherds and then moves to Uruk, which at the time was perhaps the greatest city in the world. There's a lot more that we could say about this poem as literature, but see those two other courses from the Teaching Company, which both will treat this poem as literature. We need to go back and take a look at the story as heroic myth. And in order to do that, we'll put the template of our monomyth from our last lecture on top of this story and see how the details match up. This is easier to do in a way because Eva Thury and Margaret Deviney, in their introduction to mythology, have already done this. They use actually Campbell's monomyth rather than the Leeming one we used last time, but the lists are close enough to make it work. We don't know about whether there's a miraculous conception or birth for Gilgamesh, because that isn't really talked about much, but the events have to be extraordinary anyway, since he's part human and part divine. There are also no immediate threats to him in his childhood that we're told of anyway, nor are there any heroic actions he performs as a child, which are both parts of our template, since he's already the adult king of Uruk when the poem starts. The poem begins with the call to action, with the arrival of Enkidu, which jolts him out of his comfortable life and into a new one. Enkidu wants not to go fight Humbaba, since he knows the wilderness and the threats better than the city-bred Gilgamesh, and the elders of the city try to talk him out of the quest, and so does Gilgamesh's mother, who seems to want what most mothers do, that is, she wants her son to get married and settle down and have some grandchildren. He is also given supernatural aid. This is one of Campbell's categories, that once you've accepted the call, you will receive supernatural aid. Shamash, the sun god, stations allies in the mountain caves to help Gilgamesh and Enkidu as they pass through. They cross their first threshold into Humbaba's forest, which is passing from this world into another world. And there are signs to tell them that they are entering another world. When they touch the gate to the forest, their hands go numb. And then both Gilgamesh and Enkidu endure a kind of death in the forest. They become paralyzed and stupefied. But they endure their symbolic death and they complete their task, coming home with the double boon, glorious names, and cedars for building up Uruk. The poem so far has been, as we said, a complete adventure. But the second part of the poem has its own complete arc, which also conforms to our monomyth template. In this one, Ishtar becomes a femme fatale, tempting the hero from his course of action. He rejects her. She sends the bull of heaven in retaliation against the city. Gilgamesh and Enkidu kill it. The gods decide that now the pair has entered forbidden territory and one of them must die. Enkidu is the one chosen to die, and his death becomes the hinge on which Gilgamesh's first adventure turns into the second one. It happens the moment that he holds his dead companion in his arms and then decides to seek the secret of eternal life. After his expected period of isolation, he lays aside his kingly power and regalia. He clothes himself like a pilgrim and sets out on the second quest alone, which is a much more profound quest than the first one. The search this time is for Utnapishtim, who holds the only possible key to immortality. He crosses a threshold again when he travels across the mountains of the rising and setting sun, which are guarded by scorpion people and other monsters. He passes through days and nights of impenetrable darkness in the heart of mountains. And this constitutes for Gilgamesh another death, this one even worse than the one he experienced in Humbaba's forest. He receives supernatural aid again, but this time he pretty much spurns it, since all of his guides tell him to give up, go home. you'll never find what you're looking for. Siduri is one of those supernatural assistants who comes along, who shows up along the way, and he meets her on the shores of the ocean in death, and she tells him to go home, make the most of the human lot. There are other trials and obstacles and tests along the way. When he gets to Utnapishtim's island, Utnapishtim says, well, you think you're capable of immortality, then here's a test for you, a simple test. Stay awake for 7 nights and 7 days. Gilgamesh is so exhausted from his journey that he immediately falls asleep and fails the test. But he does learn, even though he fails at all of these tests, he does learn secret wisdom from Utnapishtim, who tells him the story of the flood. And he also gives him a magic plant that can restore youth, but then he loses the plant to a snake. There's a touching detail about that part of the story. The reason he didn't eat the plant right away and renew his own youth is because he said he wanted to take it back and share it with the old men who sit on the city walls. It's a touching detail. Had he not chosen to do that, the snake might not have gotten the plant. So he comes back home seemingly no better off than when he left, but there are boons. He now knows what it means to be a good king, and he brings back some hard truths about human mortality and a determination to live on after death with what he can accomplish in the time he has. The poet says at both the beginning and the end of the poem that Gilgamesh is a hero not so much because of what he did, but because of what he learned. And these are not small things. So, the monomyth can account for this story, giving us perhaps a little more confidence in that monomyth, at least as an analytical tool, which is what we're using it for in these lectures. I want to end with one last item about that episode that turns the first part of the poem into the second. This is where Ishtar offers Gilgamesh a chance to become her consort. When she makes that offer to Gilgamesh, this is what she says. She says, "Come to me, Gilgamesh, and be my bridegroom. Grant me the seed of your body. Let me be your bride, and you shall be my husband. I will harness for you a chariot of lapis lazuli and of gold, with wheels of gold and horns of copper, and you shall have mighty demons of the storm for draft mules. When you enter our house in the fragrance of cedar wood, threshold and throne will bring you tribute from the mountains and the plain. Your ewes shall drop twins, and your goats triplets. Your pack ass shall outrun mules, your oxen shall have no rivals, and your chariot horses shall be famous far off for their swiftness." Ishtar, as we've noted before, is simply the Semitic name for Inanna, whom we remember as the great goddess from Lecture 14. Her consort, remember, was the shepherd Dumuzi. Gilgamesh says to her, in the past, your consorts haven't fared very well. And he ends up by saying, if I become your consort, if you and I become lovers, why won't the same things happen to me? She, as we said, is insulted, calls down the bull of heaven, whose killing leads to Enkidu's death and sets Gilgamesh on his second quest. As the great goddess, Ishtar is in this episode inviting Gilgamesh to become a vegetation god, inviting him back into the world of nature and the world of the mother. He would have to die at the end of the growing season, as her other consorts have, but he would in some fashion be reborn every spring to plow her fields, to guarantee milk and grain and game and fish. His rejection of her can mean a number of things. For one, this is another signal of the end of the age of the goddess, making way for the new supreme sky god, in this poem, Shamash, who pretty much takes over as guardian of Gilgamesh for Ishtar. And in the process, and we've noticed this happening in earlier lectures as well, in the process, the great goddess is turned into a femme fatale, trying to tempt Gilgamesh from his call to action. We looked at that process back in Lecture 16. In choosing his own way over serving the goddess, what Gilgamesh is also doing is selecting a new course for patriarchal society. Rivka Scharf-Kluger, in a book called The Archetypal Significance of Gilgamesh, says that this is a growing up story. It's an advance in human consciousness. The male frees himself from the dependent mode in which he's cared for, nurtured, immersed in the world of the mother. When he makes this break, he enters the masculine world of rationality and individuality. Kluger studied with Jung, so she sees the pattern not so much gendered as in archetypal terms. She sees this as the emergence of the human race from instinctual and unconscious worlds to that of consciousness and rationality. In her reading, from here on, the male hero will be more individualistic, will seek answers more on his own, rather than accepting the community shared values in which, as a child of the Great Mother, he is inevitably embedded. Paul Davis, in commenting on this precise moment of the poem, says much the same thing. He says, "This is not a simple request for sexual pleasure. She, that is Ishtar, represents the earth's fertility and is proposing that Gilgamesh become the year king. As such, he symbolizes the annual vegetative cycle and must be sacrificed to the Great Mother in order to guarantee the harvest at the end of the season. Gilgamesh's negative response includes a litany of Ishtar's former lovers, all of whom were sacrificed in some manner. Gilgamesh's rejection of this role amounts to a major turning point in masculine consciousness. Freed from the annual round of the mother goddess, Gilgamesh is charting a new destiny for the patriarchal hero as a solitary individual, meeting challenges on his own and searching for personal answers." Now, both of these critics give rather positive spins to what happens in this episode. As we noted back in Lecture 16, there are different evaluations of this stage in the change in human consciousness possible. Next time, we will take up another hero myth. That one, a very, very popular and widespread one. In fact, by now, that may be close to a universal myth, that of King Arthur and the Round Table.